Chapter 4. 2 Kevins, 1 Ogger, and a Boober. One day Ron dropped by my place and brought with him a kid from down the street named Kevin. I had never met him before and was quite put off that Ron would bring some strange kid to where I lived. Now, instead of being friendly, and that Ron was my friend, and this guy was a friend of Ron's, someone a little more normal maybe would have offered them a cold drink or something. I was really funny and uptight like that. I let him in and Kevin was kind of quiet. I don't remember having too much to say to him, and I was almost pissed off that this strange dude was hanging out with us here at, quote-unquote, my place. He didn't draw like we did, he didn't have much to say, and just kind of stood there. Maybe I could have recognized that he might have had insecurities like me and acted more friendly. So like the normal routine, I put on a Kiss record or something, and we drew and were talking about drums, guitar, and being in a band someday. By this point, Ron and I were already in a hugely successful stadium air band. You know, when you put the music on, make sure no one can see you through any windows, and become a band with fake, invisible instruments, lip-syncing to the record. Well, Ron and I quite frequently headlined some pretty big venues. Ron suggested we let Kevin in our band. What? I thought he was crazy. This was something we did in private, kind of like a secret. Not anymore, apparently. But I reluctantly agreed and put Kevin on bass guitar. That is, the invisible bass guitar. I guess Kevin passed the audition. We were in a pinch and the fans were waiting. So we were now a trio. I was on the drums, Ron was the singer and guitar player, and Kevin was on the bass. And he better not mess up. We would perform air concerts, sometimes entire albums at a time. In order to be fair, I would let Ron match my Kiss songs with an equal number of other songs from bands he liked, like Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath, and Jethro Tull. Kevin was allowed no creative input. When we were hanging out drawing and stuff, I would play a new Kiss album at the time called Music from the Elder. It was simply a concept album that was nothing more than a pot shot at following what was going on with successful albums like Pink Floyd's The Wall. At this point, it was a supreme low in Kiss's career, and the album was a total flop, but you couldn't tell me that. I was a fan and had been since about 1975. To ditch my favorite band would be so wrong. I think I was the only kid in 20 square miles to even have that record. Kevin told me that he liked Kiss. We started talking about Ace Frehley, drawing Les Paul guitars, which is what Ace played. You know, this kid Kevin, he just might be all right. I guess he won me over. Lucky him. In some time, Kevin and I would eventually form a strong bond with music and would know each other for years ahead, eventually becoming more serious about learning music, and eventually graduating to rather cheap but real instruments. But he wouldn't always be Kevin. There was another Kevin, Kevin number 2, who I would meet through being friends with Ben from across the street. Kevin number 2, even as a young kid, was a straight shooter. I liked him because he had a lot of guts, and unlike a lot of other kids, he did no bullshitting whatsoever. He stood up for himself and would stand up for someone else too, if it was right. And I definitely remember him standing up to some people. Once he had an argument and took a punch from a muscle-bound older guy in the parking lot of the pizza place, right in the ribs, and still didn't back down. The older guy even looked at him with surprise. He was a tough cookie. Poor Kevin, in my opinion, lived all the way at the bottom of town, at the very lowest point of the hill, across from the Hampton Town Park. So whenever he was to do practically anything, he had to ride his bike about a mile straight up to get anywhere. One of our favorite swimming holes was behind the New Hampton Inn Bar in the Musconecton River. There was a rope swing, and no one ever bothered us. What must have sucked for Kevin number 2 was he had to ride his bike all the way to the top of town so we could get everyone together, just so we could coast right back down the hill past his house to get to the river. He must have been in great shape, and he was nearly as thin as I was. It must have been all that excessive cardio on top of being a young teen when your body burns up calories like no tomorrow. So now a terrible dilemma in the story. We have 2 Kevins. Luckily, John, a friend of ours from Glen Gardner, who later figures into the story, would change that and tattoo Kevin number 1 with the nickname Boober permanently. So permanent, in fact, he might as well have had his birth certificate changed. All of our friends probably never knew how he got his name, but I was there and I can give a first-hand account. At this time in the early 80s, there was a new show on TV called America's Bloopers and Practical Jokes. It was one of the first of its kind, where they showed TV blooper reels, practical jokes, and outtakes from other shows. So one evening, Glen Gardner John was at my house for a sleepover. John, Kevin number 1, and I were walking down the road from my place, and it was dark. As we were walking in the dark, Kevin seemingly almost tripped over his own 2 feet just out of nowhere. I said, "What the hell was that?" He replied, "I don't know. It must have been a rock there or something." John chimed in with, "Okay, sure, Blooper." So John and I continued to call him Blooper. The next day, some other kids overheard us referring to Kevin as Blooper, but misunderstood somehow and thought we were calling him Boober. So there was now more kids calling him Boober than Blooper, and it just stuck as Boober. Isn't life funny? For the rest of the time I would know him, I would never call him Kevin again, and I don't remember anyone referring to him as anything but Boober. So John from Glen Gardner gave him his name, sort of. And that's how it happened. Let the history books show. I wonder if people still call him that. Another friend of ours, no mob lingo intended, was named Ed. He lived across Route 31 on the other side of town. I would know Ed a little through the alternative school I attended for a brief stint, but we all became friends when he had a fallout of sorts with a gang he ran with from Bunvale, New Jersey. Something went wrong between them, they became enemies, and by default, he was just around more, and we all became friends. I knew the Bunvale gang just a little. They were a pretty rough bunch. Whatever happened between them, it must have been pretty serious. I remember Ed telling me a story of how he was on the way home on foot and the Bunvale gang came around the corner in a car, which I believe was an old first-generation Camaro at the time. There were probably at least 4 of them in the car, and they spotted Ed, sped up to catch up with him and jump him. Ed, not standing a chance against all of them, ducked into someone's yard. They started getting out of the car to get him, and he resorted to diving through the front door of a stranger's house, who thankfully had the door unlocked. Once inside, the folks were home and stood there looking at this kid who just let himself in like a herd of buffalo and shut the door behind him. He introduced himself quickly and told them there was a gang outside that were going to kill him. I guess they let him stay put for a few moments, enough time to slip out the back door when the coast was clear. Ed lived on a little dead-end road on the basement-level floor of a split-level house with the rest of his family. He had 2 sisters, Betty Jane and Wendy, a stepbrother Victor, and a baby toddler brother named Midgie. Ed's mom had been remarried to a Puerto Rican man named Mario who worked at the Asbury graphite mill. Mario was a quiet guy and we respected the hell out of him. He was pretty stocky and we thought he resembled Mr. T. I guess he kind of did. When he spoke, we definitely shut up and listened. More often than not, when you walked in Ed's house, the smell of Spanish rice would fill the air. I wished I could have taken home a bucket of it. Once there was a picnic out back. It might have been Mario's birthday. There were about 1 million of Mario's friends and relatives there. The smoke from the grill and the Latino music. I thought, man, these people really know how to have a good time. Mario had a nephew, Manuel, who was unusually quiet and would come visit sometimes. He might have been from Easton or Phillipsburg. When he was around, he would come with us to wherever we were having a beer huddle and hang out. Everybody liked him. The last I remember seeing him, it was at a party at, surprise, underneath the Route 31 bridge. When it was time for him to go, he said goodbye to everyone and started on foot back to Ed's house to meet his ride. He was buzzed up and probably high, too. Manuel was kind of pudgy, and as he was walking away on the tracks, we noticed he had a funny kind of walk going. Kind of like a turtle up on 2 feet, if you can picture that. The whole gang was in tears. We wanted him to stay, but watching him walk down the tracks for a quarter mile was the high point of the party. Ed also had an uncle, his mom's brother, who would come up from the south once in a blue moon. When we heard he was coming up, we would look forward to it, because he would come to Ed's room, share his pot with us, and tell us stories from the road. One thing I also liked about him was we had something in common. He liked big girls. As he would put it, not real big and fat, just a big bone girl. Little put together, little something to 'em. Them skinny girls don't do much for me. I thought, wow, he took the words right out of my mouth. Everyone at Ed's house treated me like family, always. Once in a while, his mom would treat me to a real meal, which I never really had available otherwise. It was always out of sight, and I wished I could have 4 more plates, but I minded my manners. Ed got his nickname Ogger from his big round eyes, a family trait his mother and sisters shared with him. He, like the rest of us, listened to hard rock and metal. He could fall asleep with Ozzy Osbourne screaming in the headphones, but when he slept, his Ogger eyes would stay half open. When we would sleep over each other's houses, some of us still awake would look at him sleeping like, wow, that's the creepiest thing we ever saw. At the end of the dead-end street Ed lived on, his sisters would have a boombox out on the pavement sometimes playing Madonna when Borderline and all that was huge on the charts. Being I had bad taste in music, I wasn't a fan then, but there was something I thought was so cool about these girls out there on the road dancing the Madonna, kind of like Madonna danced in her videos. In the middle of nowhere, without a care in the world. It's little snapshots like that make the 80s dear to my heart. Ed also had another Uncle Bill who lived on the top floor of the house. I'll never forget him because one day, the coldest day I can remember with a killing wind, I lost the headlights on the Buick Opal I had been driving around on its last leg. Before that, I had only had high beams, and I continued driving around at night, high beaming every car I passed like an idiot, pissing people off. Now I had no lights at all, and it was getting dark. I didn't know where to start figuring out how to fix it. Ed asked his Uncle Bill if he would take a look. Sure enough, he came down to the parking lot, opened the hood, and got under there with a voltage tester, tracked down the electrical problem, and I'll be damned if he didn't fix it right then and there, in the freezing New Jersey cold. He made some new connections and installed a fuse so it wouldn't happen again. He showed me where the fuse was and gave me a spare so I could replace it if need be. I was beside myself and so grateful I couldn't thank him enough. There we go, on the road again. Thanks, Bill. Later, when the Opal finally wound up one step from the grave, I was on foot again for a while, and Ed had gotten $1,000 from, I think, a trust of some kind set up for him by a relative. Out of that $1,000, he bought himself a car. A blue 1970-something Plymouth Satellite, which I'm pretty sure would have had a 318 motor. It was powerful. A pure muscle car from the 70s, and it was all steel. Ed didn't quite have his license just yet, but he had the car insured and registered, so being I was on foot anyway, he had me chauffeur him wherever, and a couple of times he let me drive it home from his house so I wouldn't have to walk home in the cold. He was definitely a good friend to me. Whenever I drove that car, I respected it for him. It was a gem and would probably be worth a mint today. I thought it was awesome that Ed had his own car and would soon be getting his license and on his way. I was happy for him. Until, one day, he let my younger brother Brian drive that goddamn Plymouth Satellite. Brian was maybe just turning 15. Just a couple of blocks from Ed's house, my brother behind the wheel drove up to a stop sign, Ed in the passenger seat. Everything seemed fine. Until he hit the gas. That car had way too much power, and it went right up the embankment along the road, leaving the car sitting hillside at about 45 degrees, all torn up in the dirt, and luckily just missing the trees. After fiddling and cutting the wheel in reverse for a bit, it finally came back down out of the embankment with branches and bushes all sticking out of it. The front bumper was dragging in the dirt like a plow. It absolutely broke my heart. But hey, it wouldn't be us if something didn't go wrong. But the moral of the story is, if you have a decent car, and your friend's younger brother wants to drive it, just say no.